Creating and Teaching Inclusive Syllabi, Multiple Perspectives. My name is Eric Mayer-Garcia. I'm an assistant professor at Indiana University, Bloomington. And this is the ancestral homelands of the Mi'amiaki, Potawatomi, Sawangwa, and Lenape peoples. And they're the past, present, and future caretakers of the land that I'm zooming in from today. I wanted to briefly introduce the panel. And so today we're joined by Matt Chapman from SUNY New Paltz, Shannon Eplett from Illinois State University, Christina Frías from East Los Angeles College, Tara Houston from Louisiana State University, and Sophia Giles from Brown University. Today's panelists will present ideas for creating inclusive syllabi informed by recent conversations on anti-racism and decolonizing the canon, speaking to topics as it applies to the courses they teach and touching on courses in theater history, literature, intro courses, design, and acting courses. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first panelist, Matthieu Chapman, who's an assistant professor of theater studies at SUNY New Paltz, a medium-sized PWI state school with a liberal arts ethos. His scholarship has appeared in journals including Early Theater, Theater History Studies, and Theater Topics, among others. Chapman's monograph, Anti-Black Racism in Early Modern English Drama, The Other, is available from Routledge Press. He is also co-editor with Anna Wainwright of Teaching Race in the European Renaissance from ACMRS Press. His second book, Shattered, The Lived Experience of Black Social Death, is forthcoming from Western Virginia University Press. Please help me to welcome Matt, our first speaker today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Eric, for inviting me to do this. And also thank everyone for taking time out of your Friday afternoon to sit and hear me talk about some things I do to decenter whiteness, particularly in theater history and literature courses. So I'm going to give just sort of a brief intro, and then I'm going to go through a 5-step process that I take with any time I'm teaching a survey course or a course that appears in a curriculum that seems to, either by its title or its course description, automatically center whiteness. Since I began my undergraduate work in 2002, I have been associated with 7 different academic institutions. And each of these had a theater, history, literature curriculum that followed a similar structure. At each of these places, there was a lower division dramatic literature course, history of dramatic literature, heritage of dramatic literature, something along those lines. And then an upper division year-long theater history sequence. If your institution probably follows something like this, because this has kind of been standard, only in the last few years that people started breaking away from this, sort of year-long theater history survey. Each of the courses within this curriculum, even when at times they would signal to being a global course, they still centered whiteness in their global lens. Not through any fault necessarily of the professors teaching the course, but the curriculum itself is constructed around a Eurocentric lens of what theater is. Simply the phrase dramatic literature in each of its myriad interpretations is in itself a term that centers whiteness, as it privileges the text-based theatrical institutions of Europe while completely erasing non-text-based modes of theatrical performance that were prevalent in Africa, Asia, the global South. Similarly, theater history often begins with a separation of theater from other modes of theatrical performance by privileging cultures that had purpose-built theaters. So oftentimes when you have a theater history course, the lens is limited by the way in which the spaces of the theater are utilized by culture. In addition to the curriculum itself limiting the scope of material taught to Eurocentric heritages, the material used in these courses often center Europe in their analysis. A quick review of some of the popular textbooks used in these survey courses, such as the Norton Anthology of Drama or Theater, the Lively Art. These books often give a cursory glance, if that, at cultures and histories from outside of Europe and the Americas, or specifically, not even the Americas, specifically the United States of America. For instance, the volume 1 of the Norton Anthology of Drama contains 25 plays. Of these 25 plays, which cover the period from 400 BC to 1850 CE, only 3 come from outside of Europe. So we're looking at, 2,200 years of this anthology of drama, and they get away with 12% of the plays not being from Europe. As someone who believes that history is not the past, but knowledge of the past used for present purposes, it is my duty to remove whiteness from the center of my history courses in an effort to dismantle white supremacy. So for the rest of this paper, I will give a 5-step process that I use to decenter whiteness in these survey courses for literature and history, using my current university's course, Western Drama, sort of as the case study. The course description for Western drama at SUNY New Paltz is as follows: a survey of drama from the Greeks through the Romantic period, examination of classical dramatic literature and its relevance in modern theater. On first glance, that description seems pretty limiting, and it's limiting in a lot of ways. A survey of drama, so written text. Okay, so we've already excluded a lot of the world. From the Greeks through the Romantic period, both Eurocentric delineations of time. So now again, the description is already sort of shaping our thinking towards whiteness. Examination of classical, another phrase that is Eurocentric and points to white heritages. Dramatic literature, again, literature, the written word, and its relevance in modern theater. So the first question becomes, how you read this and you go, how do I cover 2,000 years of drama as well as its relevance to modern theater in 15 weeks? So often what happens is we start to think, what is necessary, right? What do students need to come out of this class knowing? Oftentimes when we think about what is necessary, we default towards whiteness. So first, the first step I take is look for opportunities in the description. A survey of Greek to the Romantics. Deciding what is necessary for students to come out of a class such as this often tricks us into recentering whiteness. Western and drama are both code words that center whiteness and white theatrical traditions. The title of the course influences us to center whiteness, and that's okay. If you recognize the trap, you can disarm it. So once we recognize the trap that's inherent, the course tells us what we have to do. But it doesn't tell us all that we can do. So if I have to include a survey of Greeks to Romantics, instead of doing that in 15 weeks, I will do that in 7. Second step is cut the time frame in half. When we're deciding what's necessary and we've centered whiteness, that's not an individual fault. It's actually oftentimes us trying to best serve our students. When we have an institution that centers whiteness, as well as a theatrical world outside of the institution that centers whiteness, it becomes our duty to teach students to navigate that world. So we absolutely should engage this world, but it shouldn't be the only thing we engage. So I cut that time in half. And for each, and now that I've covered the survey in 7 weeks, I decide what do I need to cover. And for each classical text, I then find a contemporary analog by a person from a historically excluded group. And that becomes the other half, the modern relevance. For instance, I will no longer teach a Shakespeare play in any course without teaching a contemporary adaptation. At this point, there are more than enough of them out there for us to be able to address Shakespeare's canon while at the same time engaging all of those who are intentionally excluded from his work. So now that we've incorporated these other voices, these non-white voices, contemporary voices into our syllabi, the next step is I pair the plays together, but I always have the students read the modern play first. In this way, students can engage these plays on their own terms and not in relation to the whiteness that the classical text is based on. Also, doing the modern play first will do a lot of the work of decolonization and decentering whiteness for us. Because if you read the modern play first, it will often reveal to the students the racism, the misogyny, the elitism, the classism that's in the classical text, both in the narrative and the dramaturgy. And then as well, it will reveal the Eurocentricity and the biases that are inherent in the translation. For instance, having students read The Hungry Woman and then read Medea, they will have a vastly different interpretation of the story of Medea. And then the last step in this process that I take is that I openly discuss with the students the ways in which the course title and the curriculum of my department is framed through a lens of white supremacist violence. There is a chance that your department's isn't. And if not, I applaud your department for making those corrections. But the university apparatus as a whole is, as Fred Moten and Stefano Harney note, the site of reproduction of conquest denial. So simply by calling our department's theater, we are already saying what our priorities are. So I begin the course with discussing the ways in which simply having that name in the department, the way the courses are structured, are designed to encourage and discourage, to include and exclude certain individuals. So that's just a quick little overview of 5 simple steps that we can take. Recognize the trap, recognize the trap inherent in the course description, cut the time frame to cover the necessary material in half, find a contemporary analog for each classical text that is included in the course description, read the modern play first, and then openly discuss the ways in which these texts are meant to be excluded from the curriculum. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. That was amazing. And I appreciate you bringing that very practical 5-step approach. That's something that we must talk about more in the Q&A that's coming up. Our next speaker is Shannon Eplett. Shannon Eplett is an instructional assistant professor in the School of Theater and Dance at Illinois State University. He received his PhD from University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. His research focuses on the history of Chicago's off-loop theater community through a sociological lens. His work is included in the recently published book, Makeshift Chicago Stages, A Century of Theater and Performance. He has presented papers and served on panels for MATC, ATHA, and SETC, and published articles in New England Theater Journal and Theater History Studies. He has been twice a fellow of the Newberry Library and part of the Newberry Consortium in American Indian Studies, and also as the Susan Kelly Power and Helen Hornback Tanner Fellow. Shannon is a member of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians and is developing a performance piece based on the life of Anishinaabe poet Jane Johnston Schoolcraft. He teaches courses in theater history, dramatic literature, devising, and arts administration. Please help me welcome Shannon.
Hi, Ani Boju, Nin Shannon Indijenikas, Bawating Dojaba. So my name is Shannon Eplett. I'm an enrolled member of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. So I teach theater history at ISU. It is a 2-semester required course for all theater majors. They're usually juniors and seniors. I have 2 sections of about 25 students each semester. And Matt gave me a great setup. It's a linear narrative theater history course. ISU is a state teachers college with a large and very practice-focused theater department. It's where Steppenwolf started. So in the fall, it is supposed to cover Greece to Shakespeare. In the spring, it is, the Restoration, French neoclassicism, up to the present. I usually get about as far as Waiting for Godot. So most of my students come from Chicago and the suburbs. They often don't know / don't care much about theater history in the first place. They just are there to act, direct, design, etc. So getting them engaged and focused and, helping them to see the relevance of the course is kind of the big challenge. And as I said, it's a Western linear theater history course. I also have them read plays from each period. So the challenge with trying to decolonize / diversify a course like that, especially with Greece and Rome, medieval times, etc., is that it is totally white and male and Western until you get into the Middle Ages with Hroswitha and Hildegard, etc. So I haven't gone as far as Matt is going. So I'm this is kind of a middle way, right? This is sort of like a small change without overhauling my entire syllabus. A little way to do this, and it's kind of specific. So what I did this year with Greek theater, I usually have them read a Greek tragedy. They've often read Oedipus already in another course. So I usually like to do Medea. For one thing, everyone who has ever been dumped can sort of relate to it. And this year, rather than just read a translation of Euripides, I taught the plot and the background, and then had them read one of 5 contemporary adaptations of the play in which the Medea character was a marginalized person. So on a side note, sort of adjacent to this, I use a lot of PowerPoint, I use a lot of humor in my teaching, and I sort of create some characters within the course of my course. So at Eric's request, he's gonna be sorry about this, I'm gonna start with Question Kitty and then go into Medea from there. So I begin every lecture with this little character appearing, Question Kitty. And this is the, does anyone have any questions portion of the class. Now here's where this could all go down in flames with me trying to screen share, but let's just try it out. Okay, so hopefully this is gonna work. Okay, all right, it looks like it's working, so that's good. Okay, so Question Kitty, it's a slide of a cat raising her paw, like people, right? And over time, this becomes more elaborate, right? She meows, she talks, she does little tricks. She incorporates throwbacks to other things in class. She celebrates the holidays, she's wished students happy birthday. It's come to light that she loves everyone.
Chaka Khan, Chaka Khan, Chaka Khan, Chaka Khan. Chaka Khan, let me
right. Oh, and she likes Prince.
We need you to rap.
This will probably get Aster in trouble with the Prince estate, so my apologies. I didn't think about that. Anyway, they can edit this out.
New power soul. Gotcha.
Question Kitty is the trickster figure, right? This is me channeling the Anishinaabe storytelling and trickster tradition. She's an unstable character who can address the moment. She's kind of the student's avatar and advocate in the course. So they look forward to Question Kitty, and nobody ever asks a question at this point in class, but they know they can, and they do ask questions in the class. So when I teach Medea, I really do start where they're at. And I have to dispel this little bit of, they're a little confused about this. It's not that Medea. So Medea, I start with, it's the archetypical story of the woman scorned. And, the moral of the story, at least in Euripides, is kind of, don't screw with crazy. But the play still resonates because people still cheat, they get their heart broken. So I give the background of the play to them. And I start with this. A lot of my students, like I said, are from Chicago, and WGN, the Chicago Superstation, every Easter would show this creepy stop motion thing from 1963. This thing gave me nightmares as a kid, but they often know this. So, and it's the movie Jason and the Argonauts. It is kind of the backstory of Medea. So we start there. And then I give them, the backstory, right? Jason, and he is from Iolcus, and he is sent to Colchis with the greatest heroes to steal the golden fleece. And there he meets a dame. It's always a dame, Medea, who is, Medea, right? So she goes back with him. She kills her brother. They land in Iolcus. Medea gets him into trouble. and they end up in Corinth. Okay, so that's the backstory. And then I give them what happens in Euripides' version, right? The breakdown of the characters, and there's Creon and, you know, hey, Jason, why don't you marry my lovely daughter? And Jason says, sure. And, you know, bad things go from there. There's a fight, there's some dead bodies, and it ends with Medea flying off in a flying, you know, chariot drawn by dragons. Okay, so what I have them do then, I give them all that, and then I assign them, this was groups of 4 to 5 students, to read one of these 5 versions of the play. And I'll list them here and then I'll stop the screen share madness in a second, but we do Another Medea by Aaron Mark, Black Medea by Ernest Ferlita, Mojada by Louis Alfaro, The Hungry Woman, which came up already, and The Tragedy of Medea Jackson. So let me stop my screen share. Okay, so like I said, 4 to 5 students are assigned to each of those. They're supposed to read it and come back to class ready to talk about it and tell their classmates, right? So it's a very informal kind of presentation. It's really just me kind of asking them, so who read Black Medea? Okay, tell me about it. And I make notes on the board, and pretty soon the board is covered with 5 different iterations of the same story. So the outcomes, they really liked the Medea Jackson story and its background. It was written for a women in prison project, written and performed by women in prison. Another Medea, which is the gay male contemporary version, was a great read. They thought it would make a great podcast. We weren't sure how it would work on stage. It's a one-man show, which is a little, you know, like, it's a great read though. Black Medea, which is set in 1810 New Orleans. Medea's a Haitian woman. They needed some more dramaturgy, some more historical background to get it. Like, dramatically it works really well, but they often didn't quite get the context of it. Mojada was, the last 10 pages were great. The first 30 pages kind of dragged. This was the class's consensus. The Hungry Woman mystified them. They were kind of lost. I sort of presented it to them. I didn't go into depth about each play before they read it. And I kind of sold it as sort of a dystopian futurist thing. And there's just a lot in that play. So what they come to is this: Medea is a play that tells a story of the dispossessed, the abject, the powerless, and what happens when they attempt to even the score and the cards are stacked against them. Okay, which is, I think, a great lesson. I mean, that is the takeaway there. So following this, I brought in a guest lecturer. This was, her name is Shannon Flores. She's a recent graduate from the master's program at ISU. So many of my students already knew her, but she did her thesis work on the dramaturgy of Sherry Moraga's play, The Hungry Woman, and the emergence of Chicana feminism. So she gave us a history of the Chicano movement, feminism within the Chicana feminism movement, and the dramaturgy of the play. And it was, the students really got into this. It was new territory for most of them. And she really, through her talk, kind of led us to the idea that Moraga's play is, she's really theorizing the emergence of non-binary gender. Some of the students had trouble with that. It's like, well, you know, she's not, the main character is non-binary. Why doesn't she just say that? And I'm like, well, that category didn't really exist when she wrote the play. She's really thinking it through. So that was kind of a great moment, you know, that they got that. So the students got that Medea is a story not so much about an angry woman written by a dead white dude, but it's a trope about dispossession and revenge that can speak to culturally specific things, but it also remains universal. We all get our hearts broken. We all feel powerless. We all want revenge sometimes, but we usually stop short of what Medea does. So it was a small change, but it made a huge difference in the course. I didn't have to like upend a syllabus that already existed, but I could incorporate this, and it really got them engaged early in the semester. It got them thinking about race and class and gender and lots of cool stuff. So anyway, that's where I'll stop. At the very least, they got some neat monologues and scenes, you know, for the acting students. But anyway, I will stop there. So miigwech, thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. That was an incredible deep dive into your teaching. I appreciate that, and the animations. So our next speaker is Christina Frías. Christina Frías is full-time faculty in the Theater Arts Department at East LA College and frequent guest lecturer at UCLA in the Department of Chicana o X and Central American Studies. She also works as an actor, director, and storyteller for the stage in multimedia platforms. Christina's performance and teaching practice is rooted in theater for social justice and centers stories by and for the global majority. She teaches acting, directing, Chicana OX theater, and general education courses at ELAC. Christina Frías is the first Latinx theater faculty to be hired full-time at East LA College. Please help me in welcoming Christina. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Eric. This is so wonderful, and it's been great to hear my two colleagues speak to these different Greek adaptations. I'm coming from Tongva land here in Los Angeles, and I'm coming to the work as a theater practitioner trained as an actor. So I enter the work very much from a performative space. So I want to invite everyone here in the room before I continue to take a breath with me. However you would like, you could be sitting, laying on your bed, but let's just take a big breath in and exhale out. Big breath in and exhale out. And one more time. Thank you. So this is how I start my teaching, even if it's an introduction to theater course, a Chicano theater class, an acting, directing, always with breath, and traditionally in a circle. Here on Zoom, you know, we're in our little blocks. But I find that ritual basically brings us to the present and just gives space for a different kind of learning. I'm going to look at my notes and try not to speak fast, but I want to get in as much as I can. So I wrote in my notes, see students, listen to students, center students. So living in Los Angeles, you know, many of our public institutions of learning are predominantly Latino, Hispanic. So in the case of ELAC, we're at about over, I would say 70% Latinx students. And I'm the first Latina hired full-time. So I think that in and of itself speaks to anti-racist theater in a very direct way. I'm very proud of this position, which I just accepted 2 years ago, but it also gives me pause. It is complicated for me because it, you know, makes me sad and angry that it's taken that long in East LA College, right? In East LA, where we have Latinos from all over Latin America. The beauty of having been a theater arts practitioner for 30 years is that I have worked on most of the plays that my contemporary colleagues are centering in their classes, hopefully. So for example, the Greek trilogy of Luis Alfaro, I recommend everybody get this book, because as the two prior speakers spoke, there's so much here that you can use to center the stories of what I call the global majority, non-white people living here on planet Earth, and are nice complements to, you know, the Greek classic texts. So I'm just going to share some of what I do with Luis Alfaro's book and work. Is that I will have students read both scripts like we've seen before. Let's say I'm working on Oedipus by Sophocles. I'll have them do a compare and contrast with Luis Alfaro, Oedipus El Rey. But I'm very conscious that my community of students are Spanish speaking. Sometimes they only speak English, but they understand Spanglish. So reading a classic ancient text may not be as accessible to them. So having a published book like this has really expanded not only the canon, but the opportunity for educators like us to have different tools, right? To introduce these classics texts by centering, in this case, Latinx community. So sometimes I'll project it onto a screen and I'll invite my students to read it out loud. And just that action, giving them that space to voice words that are familiar to them, is transformative in the classroom. I give them an assignment where they get to select a scene or a monologue to present. I don't always ask them to memorize it, depending on which class it is. Of course, if it's acting, they would learn it and perform it. But if it's an introduction to theater class, I'll still do this exercise as a way of entering the voice, the rhythm, the tone, the style of Luis Alfaro. I'm lucky enough to have worked with Sheri Moraga, was my teacher at UC Berkeley. She's a colleague and dear friend. So I've worked on her play. I put in a link and you'll see a picture of us. I played Luna in The Hungry Woman at UC Santa Barbara a few years ago. And Luis Alfaro is also a colleague. So what does this mean? This means if I'm at an institution or in a department that's predominantly white, and there may not be people of color to speak to the work in the department, but I can certainly invite in guest artists. So that's what I've done in my time at ELAC. I've invited Luis Alfaro. We did a big campus-wide conversation about the publication. Next week, I'll be doing a guest artist talk, and you're all welcome, with Marisa Chivas, another extraordinary Latina, Latinx, Cuban-American, writer, actor, filmmaker, playwright. Everyone should have this book. It just got published this summer, actually. Great tool for acting and teachers, everyone, educators. It's just such a wonderful alternative tool to the Eurocentric teachings that, have been shoved down our throats all this time. I'm going to show another book. I'm doing show and tell today. Another extraordinary book that everyone should have. Luis Valdez, the founder of Teatro Campesino, just published his first book, Theater of the Sphere, The Vibrant Being. So my hope is to also do a conversation with him. So why am I showing these books? And I have a huge stack next to me. Obviously, we all know we need to show that our canon has expanded. It's not enough just to talk about it. I need to know that when my students come into my office, they see all these books and they know that I am trying to include alternative voices than what we have traditionally been taught. One other book that I use a lot in my acting, in my scene study class, this, Monologues for Latino, Latina Actors, edited by Micha Espinosa. And there's another one just like it, Scenes for Latinx Actors by Latinx Playwrights. Wonderfully edited and curated short scenes. It's a great resource here for actors and teachers. And, I'll ask students, bring in, any ideas you have, right? And then I'll just make these available and encourage them to include these as part of their scene study. This other book that everyone may know about is Shakespeare and Latinidad. I haven't read this yet, but I want to. And just the fact that it says Shakespeare and Latinidad makes me feel included, makes me feel empowered, makes me feel inspired as a Latina performer, as a Latina educator. These books are everything. For me, having Sheri Moraga as my Chicano theater instructor when I was a 22-year-old young student radicalized my life, changed my path. So again, we hear big words about, equity, inclusion, diversity, but I wanted to give you like a real world example of what I am living right now and how these artists have changed my life and how I'm hoping to have this much, influence on the community that I teach by exposing them to this canon. And to me, that's an anti-racist action I can do every day. Let me see if I probably already got way past the 5 minutes. I don't know, 5 minutes. Okay, a few more minutes. So one other exercise that I'd love to do, and that book is at campus. So, but it is an acto, ACTO. It's El Teatro Campesino, the early actos, but this is a great book too, because I don't know if you could see it. It's Yolanda Broyles Gonzalez, and it's a real in-depth analysis of Teatro Campesino, the farm workers theater that started as the cultural arm of the United Farm Workers Movement, alongside Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. And, you know, these were short scenes, political sketches that were mainly improvised with non-actors, which makes it a really beautiful teaching tool, because if you're doing an introduction to theater course or a Chicano theater course with non-actors, you know, it takes the pressure off of them. And so I have guidelines, which I could share later and in the Q&A. And they do these midterm projects where I break them into groups and they choose a social issue and follow the acto form and structure, which is basically about, you know, find a social issue, satirize the opposition, use humor as a tool of education, and hint at a solution, right? And you're using the structure, which is very cartoon-like, very physical, and not a lot of dialogue. You know, they could use the signs, you know, here comes the, you know, police, or, you know, they could use masks to personify these characters, the protagonists, the antagonists in these short political sketches. So the acto, because it's very short, is a wonderful reading to do, because they're learning about Teatro Campesino, but then it's a great model to follow if you want to engage your students in the creation of an original acto from a collective point of view. I hope that was clear. I'll pull up my guidelines for a little bit later, but I'll just put the early actos. I think someone might have put it in, of Luis Valdez. And that's something, again, that I can use in a variety of courses. And it is all about theater for social justice, all about changing the world, you know, one social issue at a time. So I want to just end with a quote. I took an anti-racist workshop myself yesterday with ELAC, East LA College, and this is a Bell Hooks quote. Maybe I'll just share my screen. I'm going to try that. Forgive anything you may see that is messy. Does everyone see this? Cultural codes right here. Okay, I'll read it and along with you. Bell Hooks in Teaching to Transgress. As I work to create teaching strategies that would make a space for multicultural learning, I found it necessary to recognize different cultural codes. To teach effectively a diverse student body, I have to learn these codes, and so do students. This act alone transforms the classroom. Professor and students have to learn to accept different ways of knowing, new epistemologies in the multicultural setting. And then there's these 3 questions posed. Who are you and where do you come from? How does your identity influence your learning style? Now, how can we incorporate elements from your distinct perspective into our classroom culture so as to resist assumed knowledge and activate your education? So I just loved the questions these posed for conversation, and also how we could engage our students and kind of demystify the hierarchy of learning and start in a circle where we're all equal. Thank you.
Thank you, Cristina. And I invite you to stop sharing your screen for a second as we move on to our next speaker. That was a great presentation. I feel like you're touching on some of the work that's as a panel that has been going on in Chicano, and Chicanx theater for some time. So our next speaker is Tara Houston, who is a scenic designer and educator. Currently, she's serves as the assistant professor of scenic design at Louisiana State University and was recently appointed the Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the College of Music and Dramatic Arts. Her work as a scenic designer flourishes in collaborative environments that supports intellectual and artistic risk-taking. As an educator, she endeavors to support those environments for her students. Tara's scenic work has been featured at Caramia Theater, Skylight Music Theater, Austin Shakespeare, Casa Mañana, Swine Palace Theater, and others. In 2018, Tara participated in the Latinx Theater Commons Carnival of New Latinx Work in Chicago as a scenic designer respondent. She is member of USITT, the Guild of Scenic Arts, and is on the steering committee for the Latinx Theater Commons. In the last year, Tara has played an active role as an organizing member for the newly formed La Gente, the Latinx Theater Design Network. She lives in Baton Rouge with her Muttley dog, Obi, while her partner, Eric, finishes grad school. Please help me to welcome Tara Houston.
Hi, everybody. It's so nice to be joining you today. I don't feel like I could have been set up better than I was by the end of Christina's questions. As a designer, I'm going to provide a little context about my training. In graduate school, we were trained that designers were meant to be chameleons, that as a designer, it is your job to kind of, push down your view of the world to take on the world of the play that you're designing. And after trying to do that for a number of years, I realized that what I was trying to do is really like split my artistic psyche, right? That there is no way for me to be a designer without owning my perspective on this world. And when we approach design from a neutral place, we are likely to do more damage to ourselves and those around us than we are when we own our identities. So thank you, Cristina, for bringing this into the conversation, because a big part of my frame for design work revolves around understanding our identities as artists and how those influence our aesthetics, how that influences our ways of communicating with one another, and how that really influences the way we choose what's important in plays and what isn't. And when we're working in multicultural spaces, it can be really complex to explain our views on the world and try and understand others' views in the world. So developing that conversation and communication methods around race and identity are so vital to doing this work in meaningful and healthy ways. So that's sort of the frame that I developed prior to coming to teach at Louisiana State University. It is the first time I've lived in a community that does not have a significant Latinx population. My mom's family is Mexican American. They've been in Arizona for like 8 generations, longer than it's been a state. And it's been a reframe for me as a human to think about work being prioritized outside of my racial and ethnic identity. So working here in Louisiana, where we have, our state is about roughly a third Black, just under, I think we're at 32% Black, we're at 62% white, and then like everybody else is that mix, right? Like demographics often are. So that's a mix of Latinx, Asian, and Native, and then mixed race numbers are kind of growing in our state as well. So my frame at LSU has been a little different than what I was using when I taught in Texas and had larger Latinx populations. Here, what I've done is really think for myself about how I can teach outside of my comfort zone from a cultural lens, which has been a significant challenge and has been often a great test in my pride to stand in front of a classroom and say, I just don't understand this world as anything other than an outsider. So how do we approach communities that are different than our own? How do we have these communication or conversations in meaningful ways? Because we do see quite often that designers are hired to design shows outside of their cultural perspectives. So using our own identities as an anchor, we then start to have conversations about empathy and conversations about respectful, cultural, competent research, and thinking about finding through lines in the human experience that we can explore while grounding and making specific choices about the cultures and identities of the characters in our plays. So some of the things that I do in my classroom include all of my design classes start with a cultural identity paper, where we discuss those big 8 identities and how we kind of operate in this world. I model that work for my students by writing a new cultural identity paper every semester and throwing that into our learning management system. And from the beginning, we're inviting these conversations about, I see the world in this way. This is kind of how I'm understanding the characters in this play, so that we're always thinking about our lenses and how we approach the work. And kind of within that, I found myself needing to have some bravery about the material that I bring into my classroom, and learning better tools to navigate conversations around race, ethnicity, and identity in the classroom. And a great example that I have is the Robert O'Hara play Barbecue, if you're familiar with it. Each act rotates between a different cast. So there's a white cast and there's a black cast. The story remains continuous and the characters remain continuous, but the casting alternates scene by scene. My graduate students' minds were blown. They had a really difficult time trying to understand how to work in this piece. And part of the reason I chose it is that my mind was also blown. And what I've tried to do is bring that experimentation into the classroom. So we're asking ourselves those tough questions in a classroom setting. So we're not trying to learn how to navigate that in a production room with budgets on the line, with producers waiting, with union crews waiting to build shows, and thinking about the classroom as a space for experimentation and a space for work, and thinking about it as a laboratory. And that sort of frame has opened up a lot of bravery for me about what I bring in and how we approach those conversations. Because hopefully it lowers the stakes a little bit that this is an experiment, and experiments can fail, and we learn when they fail as well as when they succeed. And kind of taking that lens, I then began to think differently about what we might design. So I now start my classes with a non-scripted project. I have 2 different versions of this that I've experimented with. And rather than designing a show based on a script, we design installations. So the first iteration of it was that students were asked to go out into our community and find a piece of artwork that they resonated with. They journal about why they liked that piece of art, and then bring it into our classroom where they work to design an installation based on that piece of work. The next kind of step in that is that I did a similar project this year using music. And I found that when we start from a place of creativity and imagination and not spending a ton of time in analysis at the beginning of the semester, we can engage really early on in meaningful conversations about intention and audience relationships to the work. We think differently about how we're engaging in the world because it's an installation, not a play. Right? And it's different when we're designing for just the audience and a space, rather than thinking a lot about how we're serving a script. So then in the next projects, we bring in the text and remember all of those lessons about how exciting it is to sculpt space, what composition is, what audience relationships might look like in different sorts of formats, and apply all of that to a text. So we're not necessarily married to the proscenium space and then the flexible space, or we're not always married to, we do a classical play and then a modern play. We're thinking about design more holistically in my classroom, so that the real intention is to develop the artistry necessary to tell a story in visual ways and develop the communication tools necessary to explain those ideas. And in my opinion, decentering the script from the beginning is a major step forward in anti-racist practice, because we're not entirely relying on what's on the written page. We suddenly have the invitation to bring ourselves into the work in a really meaningful way from the beginning. And then think about how that translates when we're working with a collaborative team or when we're working with the text. And I consider the playwright and the text to be a collaborator with me in the room. So using that as a frame, I think, helps the conversation and helps us think really kindly and kind of protectively about what we're doing with the text in our process. I wanted to speak briefly, if I have a moment, to talk about cultural appropriation, because that was one of the questions we were kind of posed early on. And that is a major issue in design. And I am not sure that I am a perfect arbiter of what is cultural appropriation and what isn't. And I'm not sure anybody is, right? So here's my 2-minute take on cultural appropriation. 1, the best chance we have to not appropriate from someone else is to do thorough research with a kind heart. Right? How are we thinking about through lines and human experiences, but being specific about our choices? How are we making sure that the choices we make about what characters look like in the world that they live in, what pillows they put on their couch, what boxes of cereal are on their shelves, are rooted in true human experiences and not in stereotypes? So when we do our research sections, we spend time talking about stereotypes, why they exist, how they were developed, how sometimes they can benefit us in design, and how sometimes they can be really detrimental to design. And it's up to us to research the differences between those things. So that's my, like, again, 2-minute take, right? The last thing I want to say before I'm done is that I found a really wonderful essay recently called Weaving, or where's the title? Weaving Promising Practice for Inclusive Excellence into the Higher Education Classroom. And it's a 5-step take on kind of how you might examine how you operate in the classroom and invite student identities in as well. And it felt very approachable, but really well researched, and has been successful in talking to my peers here at LSU about how we might bring more of ourselves in the classroom as a way to model for our students how they might bring more of themselves into the classroom. So thanks so much today.
Thank you, Tara. That was an incredible perspective you provided from design. So excited to get to the Q&A so we can start a bigger conversation. But first, our final speaker today, I'm very excited to introduce Sophia Giles, who's a New York City-based theater actor, teacher, and facilitator. She most recently performed in Michael Kahn's final production for Shakespeare Theater Company in Ellen McLaughlin's Oresteia, which received a Helen Hayes nomination. Sophia proudly affiliates with the rich Asian American theater community, specifically creating work with Ma-Yi Theater and National Asian American Theater. Sophia has taught previously at Mount Holyoke College, SUNY Ulster, and SUNY Purchase. Sophia served among the lead organizers for the Obie Award-winning Theater Against War, THAW, and is a former 2-term elected public official for the trustee of New Paltz Central School District Board of Education. As a facilitator, she has supported the anti-racist work of Design Action and frequently collaborates with Nicole Brewer, Art Equity Cohort 2016, and current cohort of Art Equity's BIPOC Leadership Circle. She is currently the head of acting for Brown Trinity MFA program. Please help me to welcome Sophia Giles.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Eric. I'm just going to take a moment to absorb just the feast of offerings that my colleagues have just expressed. It's kind of hard to focus on what I want to share because I just really want to lift all that work up, and the labor to go against what is deeply ingrained around these institutions. It is radical work, and I honor the cost it takes in our bodies to do so. I'm especially moved by Christina's invitation to breath. I'm going to take one for myself right now. Thank you so much, Eric, for that invitation and this invitation to kind of convene here, and also to Daphnie Sicre, who offered the call. So my name is Sophia Giles. I'm going to raise my hand in case there are any deaf participants on the call. I am zooming in from Narragansett Land here on the Brown University campus. I'm also going to offer a visual description. I am a mixed race Asian woman with black hair pinned to my back. I'm wearing a black shirt, and my background is of this very vivid fruits. I'm seeing some peaches and oranges. And that really is in many ways the tenor of what I want to offer to the table, which is around accessibility. So I am very new in my position. I am like 6 weeks into a new job here at Brown University as head of acting in an MFA program. And an MFA program sort of situates itself inside of professional training. And I bring my questions and my struggles with that, both as a professional artist and what does it mean to have the light shining on all of us really around, so in this moment of reckoning, what is our work going to look like in the realm of theater? What needs to change? What has been needing to change for so long now? And who are those of us in positions of leadership, decision-making, doing under that sort of light of change? And I have to say, I'm feeling that very, very strongly. So one of the pieces that I want to offer today is how I am myself decentering whiteness in my own body. and the tension around having moved into spaces like an Ivy League institution as a first generation college graduate, teaching and in some ways training, a new cohort of professionals in things like Shakespeare. And we've heard that name invoked with, the rightful interrogation it deserves, right? And yet I am in deep conversation with myself around my own legitimacy moving into this space and what do I offer around that question of what is canon. So as it happens, I am moving into a curriculum that is in some ways already set for me. And I'm trying to mark my own time around how can I move with integrity around the questions I have around anti-racist training in my own practice. And how do I show up as myself, who has in many ways tried to carve out a space in theater, in American theater, which was not designed for me. And I draw so much spirit and power from all of these incredible offerings that my colleagues have offered. How rich, whether you want to call it expanding the canon or something that, the margins are the centers, is something that, is something that is very, very provocative for me. And by that, I mean, inside the Brown Trinity program, there are affinity spaces. So I'm very, very grateful that that table has been set for me, and that those are in some ways some of the richest places of where culture and curriculum are having some of the richest conversations. So that's what I mean about, the margins are the centers. So some of the practices I want to offer up in this feast is how do I enter into a class that's ostensibly about verse, which is, some of the preset curriculum. And there is a lot of Shakespeare happening here at Brown Trinity. There are expectations around it. The idea that, it's still the most widely produced playwright, and yet there's an expectation professionally that, that we are in some ways conversant or literate around the performance of Shakespeare. And so for me, I need to situate and identify my own position in relationship to that as a way to model for students that they have to be in constant conversation. And as an Asian American, the idea of assimilation is particularly intimate, particularly violent. So what does that look like in the classroom and how do I set it up? One of the things that I do, and I feel like it's, I hope, a more widely accepted practice, is a pre-access check-in. So in other words, literally how students get to class is one of the ways that we can see belonging. So I ask questions about access needs. I ask questions about specifically calling in any disability needs. I ask questions about language, if there are multiple languages that someone is conversant in. And that offers me an opening to talk about my own histories and the way I come to verse. So for example, it becomes a pedagogical discussion around my own history of being part of an Asian diaspora. For an example, I do not speak the language that is native to my own mother. She is Korean. And because of colonization and empire, when I speak, I carry disconnections. And so what does that mean to take on this canonical voice, and what's my entry point into that? So I hope that is an invitation to vulnerability. I hope it is an invitation to be actively deprogramming ways in which written language, ways in which the English language have wrought violence on our bodies, metaphorically and even quite literally. I also share, for me, what are two very personal but pedagogical pieces around how I frame my entry into Shakespeare. I use James Baldwin's Why I Stopped Hating Shakespeare. And I use an essay about an interview between Carol Martin and Devere Smith around the power of the word. And I remember as a student, I was an undergraduate at Northwestern, and at the time, Anna DeVere Smith came not to the theater department, but to an interdisciplinary sort of sponsorship. She did not come to the theater department, and I find that very instructive. And she was workshopping a version of a new play after Fires and Mirrors. She was working on something else. And also, you know, I'm feeling Los Angeles, the spirit of the Tongva in the room, as someone who was also born in Los Angeles. She was workshopping Twilight Los Angeles. And she gave voice at the podium, being on book, these characters who I'd never seen embodied before. And so, of course, it was, you know, it was one of those moments that really changed and transformed me. And I find that her path as an artist, working, blurring the lines of activism and citizenship and artistry, for her to say her own entry into that were the set speeches of Queen Margaret, right? So how do I organize myself or struggle to organize myself in relationship to this canon, or as Madeline Syed, an indigenous native theater maker, calls the system of Shakespeare. And I bring that in because that is something that a student in this class offered, you know, we should probably read this. And that for me is what at heart is anti-racist practice, which is relationship building. So that the students are, I am a co-learner with my students, that the students also have opportunities to be younger mentors to each other, and frankly, younger mentors to me. In this program in particular, it is incumbent on me to have right relationship to my students, which many of them are already professional. So the idea of, you know, teacher student itself needs to get decentered, right? And the idea of being an expert or someone who has all of the knowledge, it is actually more of a authentic learning experience for me to co-learn with, to unlearn with my students. And in that sense, I center my work around theater making, in the sense that when I'm in a show, there are intergenerational cast members, intergenerational you know, designers and directors, but we are all potentially peers. And that kind of flattening of hierarchy, while is, you know, often more idealized than practice, is a horizon that I'm especially interested in. And I want to be mindful and make space for question and answer, but I'd like to just offer maybe a pause here for my speaking around a frame that I find very useful, and I think within the contours of my program are particularly available, which is the community is the curriculum. I need to make relationship with my students. I need to know who they are. I need to bring them into the room. I need to let them know that their vulnerability in their questions are the path to our collective growth as artists. So for me, the community is the curriculum. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. Wow, that was such an incredible presentation, and thank you so much to each and every panelist. I wanted to thank for sharing this amazing discussion. As you said, a feast truly is a pedagogical feast. So I'm going to invite you know, folks to put questions in the chat. But why don't we get started off with this idea? One of the ideas that I think that several people talked on was about decentering the text as something that is kind of like an important step in doing this work. I think I heard it also with Tara Houston and designing installations, and Christina Frías as well, in terms of introducing acting exercises and the sort of the creation of actos, doing embodied work, you know, and it really, I think everyone kind of touched on it. So I'd just like to open it up to the panel to kind of speak to that, now that we've all kind of heard what people in other areas of the theater department are doing with that idea.
I can jump in. So just so I understand it, Eric, the idea of decentering the text?
I mean, moving away from text-based theater, or maybe even stepping away from the text, or finding a new relationship with the text that doesn't center the written word first and foremost.
Absolutely. I think this is maybe not direct, but slightly adjacent. I do feel, in order to sort of unpack some of the sort of coding inside of verse, specifically Shakespeare's verse, we do a deep dive into some of the great chain of being as a kind of worldview or cosmology. And one way to kind of shake that great chain of being that we have explored, in this semester, is bringing in the story of Sky Woman and the origin story of Turtle Island as a way to, one, bring an oral narrative, right? So it's a different kind of centering of text, perhaps, but other traditions that offer up different cosmologies. That, in other words, it's not the only one, to bring that in and to release some of the monopolizing pressure that something like Shakespeare can exert.
And I think for me, a big part of considering design without text was about prioritizing emotional engagement in the work. That I think it's really an easy trap to get led into, that our work is all intellectual, that it is, that we approach design from some kind of like distance because we are observers of the world and not participants in the world. So decentering the text for me goes back to that sense of like, we all have incredible instincts about what we like and what we don't like, and how the world works and how we interact with one another. And like, those are incredibly valuable tools that I think we forget when we're worrying about how many windows the playwright has given us and where the doors are. And those are all valuable things to think about. But like, that for me is like another layer. Let's emotionally engage first. Let's make sure that we're trusting our instincts and trusting our human selves to understand what's important about telling the story. And there's something that, removing that barrier of a text allows us to get in there emotionally in a different kind of way. And the second part of that is that it gives students agency over creation, that they see themselves from the very beginning as creators and not just people who react to other people's work. And that is a difficult interaction I think in a lot of our performance fields, right, in our design fields as well, that we feel like we're reactors to scripts, or we're reactors to notes from directors, we're reactors to what's happening in the world, rather than change agents in that process. And giving them all the reins, except the room, right? I tell them what room we're working in, but other than that, they're in control about how the world functions. And there's a power and an agency to that I think can be transformative when the students lean into it.
I'm teaching a lot of what Tara is saying resonates. I'm teaching a devising class, and I was really intrigued with your approach to design, where they're doing an installation. They're not working from a script. I work in a program that's very focused on realism and scripted work. And at the beginning of the pandemic, the question was, well, how are we going to do these plays we've already picked? And there was a lot of conversation about what do we do? And I said, well, we could devise something. And, that didn't go anywhere. And, as the year played out, some plays worked, there were some plays that worked really well on Zoom and others that, didn't work so well on Zoom. But that was like an interesting experiment. And I had to teach devising for the first time on Zoom, which was like a real challenge, but we actually made some really good work. And I had to say, like, let's stop thinking about what we can't do and what can we do in this like weird little box we're stuck in. So, that was a great experiment. And the final project was like a YouTube video, but I was pretty proud of what they did. And this year I'm teaching Devising Live, which is like a totally different class. But I had a student who is an actor in the class at the end of the day. we did some exercise, we made some little piece, and he's like, wow, we made something. And it was just like, I'm like, well, yeah. But, it was that he had agency over what he did. And it was actors, they're somehow not trained to think of themselves as creators or whatever. And it was like such a revelation to this guy that he could make something and it would be a whole thing. I mean, yeah, it's like a minute. It's, it is what it is, but he had like such satisfaction with it. I'm like, that's really the story here. So yeah, I mean, it's decentering the text. And I didn't go into teaching devising from that perspective at all, but it is a thing. It's like you can tell stories in different ways. And it's such a mind-blowing thing to some of these kids that are, knee deep in Chekhov right now. So
it's, as being someone who teaches at this point primary, literature and history courses that almost by definition rely on text, it becomes difficult to decenter text. But there are ways, and oftentimes it comes from relying on methodologies from other fields. So when you're teaching a theater history course or a dramatic literature course, those are products, right? The text is the final product, it's the result. And that's sort of how our theater students are often trained, right? It's all about the show. It's all about the paper you write and not about the process of doing it. So one of the ways that I've attempted to sort of decenter text in these theater history classes is through my own research, through anthropological research and historical research, indigenous studies, Black studies, these other fields that perhaps have more oral traditions, less text-based traditions. Oftentimes, the processes that are involved in rituals, that are involved in performance, that are involved in storytelling are documented. Oftentimes they're documented incorrectly, they're documented through a white lens, and those are things that we have to be aware of when we're digesting the information. But taking the process of a non-text-based performance culture and introducing it to your students without them reading the text and knowing what it is. Simply come in and ask a student, tell me a story of your heartbreak, and having other students get up and sort of mime that story as they do it, and then asking the questions, why are you valuing that piece of paper over these bodies that are performing in front of us, over the stories that we're handing down and sharing with one another? And we can get students to sort of question, right, the very sort of ontological structures of the way in which we craft and create history. And sort of by doing so, what histories we value. So then they can start to look at these texts through another lens as well, and start to think about not only the records that we have and what's left in front of us, but also what has been sacrificed, erased, violently destroyed to allow these things to be what gets put in front of us. So it isn't incredibly difficult because we're so much, right, in this capitalist system, we're a results-based society, to get students to a point where they can engage with a process and at the end of it be comfortable with the fact that they don't have something there's no grade on the paper, there's nothing to take home, there's no video, there's no photos, and just sort of recognize the value of engaging with those processes and the way in which it reenacts and engages with the ghosts and spirits of cultures that are buried by, this wall of text. It's a difficult thing to do. I'm someone who does have a performance background. I do have an MFA. So, I have a little bit more, my skill set is diverse enough where I'm comfortable leading those types of acting exercises and things in classes. But if you are someone with a PhD, there are workshops available where you can absolutely learn other methods of performance, methods of process, of ritual, and you can actually have students engage with and perform, recreate those processes in your classroom alongside the text that, as I said, our course descriptions will often say are necessary.
I just wanted to add, I think also you know, Sophia, when you spoke to the community as the curriculum, I love that. And, you know, if we're going to be responding and building community, you know, Luis Valdez says theater is the creator of community and community is the creator of theater, then I think we have to really respond to the moment. And like the moment we're living right now is undeniable. You know, we're living in a global pandemic still, and the brutal killing of George Floyd, you know, major culture shift, you know, major opening for departments, specifically as we're discussing this anti-racist work, to really respond to the moment as departments, but as educators individually. And how are we looking at these larger social themes, political themes, cultural events, and giving them the space they deserve, and giving our students the space that they need to process. And it may not look like anything like a theater class that day, right? Maybe it's a circle, maybe it's a circle of crying, maybe it's a ritual of something. And I think in some ways as theater educators, you know, I do believe, you know, we could approach it from this holistic practice. And it does take sometimes training and taking our own workshops to give us those tools. I see, Sophia, that you work a lot with Nicole Brewer, and I've taken some of her workshops. And I just think there's a big shift happening, and I do see it as an opening for us to kind of flip the paradigm of higher ed and the hierarchy of teaching and how we engage with our students. And I do believe they are the experts in their lives. And I often say, I am learning as much from you as you are from me. Like I know this much, but you collectively know everything. So.
I started this year framing the theater history course in the syllabus, and I thought about talking about this today and I didn't, but I'll say it now, with kind of the why study theater history, why do we have to take this class, is the idea, especially it's an, you know, Native American idea, it's not really that Native American, but the past is always present, right? It's always with us. So you need to know it. And this is a Western theater class, and I go through why that is what it is, what's limiting about it, what we're not studying exactly, and why. And then, you know, the next step is the future is unwritten. That's up to you. Like, you do need to know this past so that you can do what you need to do with it. I've now said this twice. Like we had a, I had to kind of reiterate this the other day in class, but you know, the theater industry, the community is in a moment of change, and we're rethinking, you know, the racial reckoning, all of these things, the IATSE strike, like all of this stuff. So it is changing, and you know, juniors and seniors are about to go out there, and it doesn't have to be a bad thing. I mean, you can revise this, you can fix it, but you should know the past to do it effectively. So that's kind of the perspective I've been teaching from this year. And I get a little wide-eyed, like, you know, because they're suddenly confronted with, you know, reminded again of like graduation and student loans due and all that stuff. But it's like, this is an opportunity to address some of these things that you feel are unjust. So I try to foreground that for them.
Well, I just wanted to thank everybody for coming to the panel. I know we've gone a little past our scheduled time. But really, Matt, Shannon, Tara, Sophia, Cristina, you are luminaries and leaders of our field in this important work in transitional time. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for bringing all these amazing thoughts, bringing something to this great feast of inclusive pedagogy, anti-racism. And thank you everybody who's joined us at some point today, and especially to those who are still with us here. Thank you so much.